Voice America. Live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. I've been looking forward to this interview for some time because we bring back to the microphone Dr. Jeremiah Johnston. If you are not familiar with him, he is an individual that, first of all, is the head of the Christian Thinkers Society. We have information about that on our website. He also is a pastor of apologetics and cultural engagement at Prestonwood Baptist Church, dean of spiritual development at Prestonwood Christian Academy, as well as a number of other credentials. Let me hold up a whole series of books here. Here is one that came out more than 11 years ago called Unanswered, a lasting truth for trending questions. One that came out after that, Unimaginable, what our world would be like without Christianity. And of course, one of the books we talked about more recently was The Body of Proof, the 7 reasons to believe in the resurrection of Jesus and why it matters today. Also, of course, I might just mention his Peace of God Bible, which we've talked about on this program. But today we're going to focus on his newest book, The Jesus Discoveries, 10 historic finds that bring us face to face with Jesus. So, Dr. Jeremiah Johnston, welcome back to Point of View.
So great to be with you, Kerby, and just always love our conversations, and so thankful to the Lord for the ministry of Point of View.
Let me, if I might, for just a minute, some people remember Where's Waldo? We're playing the game Where's Jeremiah Johnston these days, because I saw a clip the other day where you were at Cascade Hills Church, which I believe is in Georgia, and I think
correct.
You were in the midst of, again, showing the shroud. So I never quite know where you're going to be.
It's amazing. I go wherever God opens a door where I can share the truth of the gospel, and it never ceases to amaze me how it transforms people's lives.
Well, one of the networks that broadcasts this program, one of many, is in Augusta, Georgia. And a while back, I guess really almost 2 years ago, we were actually at a restaurant meeting with some people that were listeners. And that restaurant's real close to Warren Baptist Church, where Pastor David McKinley is. And I look up and there's a sign about the shroud display being there. So for our Georgia listeners, it turns out that if you would like to see some of the things we're going to talk about, you're probably in the right place because you seem to be making the tour.
That's exactly right. It's at Columbus, Georgia right now at Cascade Hills Baptist Church through Thursday of this week. It's all free. It's open and available to the public.
Well, again, I jokingly say I never know where you're going to be because, let's see, you were at Davos. You were with Glenn Beck, not only in this country, but in Italy with him when you were there at the Shroud. Eric Steckelbach, Sadie Robertson, Sean Ryan, Michael Knowles. Hope you're trying to straighten out that Michael Knowles guy, but nevertheless, you are everywhere. So it is very, very encouraging to have you join us today here on Point of View. The book is entitled The Jesus Discoveries, and we're going to talk about some of the archaeological discoveries, but then there's a part 2 and 3, which talk about the Christian mind, which is a great promotion for the ChristianThinkers.com website and how to dig deeper. But in some respects, let's talk about why you have actually written this, because maybe you've had this question where your kids come up to you and they say, okay, Dad, we believe Jesus exists because of the Bible, but do we have any evidence outside of the Bible that Jesus exists? You ever had that question?
Oh, Kerby, you've just hit the nail on the head. That's the whole reason I wrote this book is as a dad of 5, my highest priority after following Jesus is passing the faith on to my kids. And what's really cool about this book is it's so readable. It's crisp chapters written for the layman. My 9-year-old son, Abel, was reading me a chapter the other night, and that is by design. I'm not writing for scholars in this book. I'm writing to give answers to men and women who just have questions and they need quick, crisp answers. I'm sure a thinker like yourself would appreciate too. I went to great lengths to get permissions for all the photographs in the book because I want people to experience right in the book these discoveries like they're holding them in their own hands. And so my children challenged me. That they said, Dad, what do we know about Jesus? But hold on, before you talk, Dad, you can't use the Bible. What do we know about Jesus outside of the Bible? And it turns out I wrote a whole book and said, hold my Diet Coke. I'm going to write a book to answer you. And it's so fun that our faith is so evidence-driven. And Kerby, this is something I'd really like to just focus on, if you don't mind, because it seems to be resonating with people. Faith is always defined by its substance. Okay, it's faith defined by the way I like to say it is faith is always defined by its object. What are you believing in? And in the Christian tradition, we have a set of facts and a person, Jesus, and the death, burial, and physical bodily resurrection of Christ that we place our faith in. When we place our faith in Jesus and those facts, we are forgiven. So there is an evidence-based Christianity that the Bible talks about from the earliest days. Acts 1:3 says, after his suffering, he, Jesus, presented to them and gave, I love this, Kerby, many convincing proofs that he was alive. He appeared to them over a period of 40 days and spoke about the kingdom of God. And so for the Christian out there who's like, I don't need to listen to this broadcast. I have faith. You know, we're not celebrating our faith. It's not faith in faith. We can always grow closer to Jesus. What we're celebrating is that we have an evidence-based faith, that the things that occurred in the Bible really happened. They were real people, real places, real events, not legend, not fairy tale, not lore. And guess what? The archaeology bears that out. The excavations that bear that out are strikingly remarkable. And then there's discoveries that most believers are totally unaware of that are so powerful that confirm, that's the term I use, they confirm the message of the Bible in wonderfully assuring ways. And so I just wanted to grab the reader and guide them by the hand and say, let me just walk you through the fact that we can know 65 facts about the birth, the life, the miracles, the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus from extra biblical sources before we ever crack open the Bible. And no other religion can say that. And so I also want to challenge our audience, make sure that you're not more pious or godlier than the writers of the New Testament. I meet some Christians, and they're fine Christians. They're like, why do I need to be a thinker? I have my faith. Why do I need to know about proofs? Listen, because the New Testament wouldn't exist without proofs. None of the 8 authors of the New Testament would have written a word of the New Testament had not they seen Jesus alive and had the evidence to bear that out. So there's a blessing on this kind of activity that we're talking about of studying the evidence for our faith.
Well, again, you're going to look in, as we take a break, we'll come back and talk about 10 of those discoveries. And because we've had Titus Kennedy with us talking about some of the archaeology, we have touched on 1 or 2 of those, the Miracle Cup and the James Ossuary. But I thought we would come back, obviously, and talk about the Shroud of Turin. Who is that man in the shroud? What evidence do we have of that? And again, back to the point you were making just a minute ago, in terms of this extra biblical evidence of Jesus apart from the Bible. I know years ago at Probe Ministries, we had one of our individuals, Dr. Michael Gleghorn, wrote a piece, and it was just on extra biblical references to Jesus. That to this day still is one of the more popular entries on our website, and it just illustrates again that what you are trying to do here and how you are trying to answer some of your children's questions are still going to be very relevant. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to spend some time, first of all, looking at the Shroud of Turin, a couple of the other discoveries as well. It's all part of this new book. You can certainly find it in your bookstore, but matter of fact, it's #1 bestseller right now. The Jesus Discoveries, 10 Historic Facts that Bring Us Face to Face with Jesus. And again, a whole section at the end here that gets into some of the other aspects of how to think about these issues as a Christian thinker. And of course, ChristianThinkers.com is a website we have linked. So let's come back and talk about this right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Ben Shapiro says it's time to ask some serious questions. The key question is whether we're safe anymore. Of course, it is a question we've been asking for years, given the crime rate, along with an open border. He focuses attention on the killing of 18-year-old Sheridan Gorman in Rogers Park in Chicago. As I've mentioned in previous commentary, she merely tops the list of more than 1,000 Americans killed by criminals here illegally. This expanding list illustrates why we need a robust debate about immigration policies, sanctuary policies, and public safety. He focuses on sanctuary city and state policies by saying critics argue that policies limiting cooperation between local law enforcement and federal immigration authorities can have serious consequences. The sanctuary policy in Chicago restricts any coordination That's why the suspect, who had been arrested previously, was not turned over to ICE. Supporters of stricter enforcement contend that the more consistent cooperation would prevent repeat offenses. This makes sense. If an individual is here illegally and commits a crime, he or she is more likely to commit another one. America may be divided on some of these policies, but anyone concerned about public safety should also be concerned about proper enforcement. Sanctuary policy supporters argue that enforcement alone cannot address the root causes of crime and that policy responses must be broader in scope. We certainly can and should address the causes of crime, but that should not keep us from enforcing the law and making Americans safe. We shouldn't even be asking the question, are we safe anymore? I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Dr. Jeremiah Johnston. The book is entitled The Jesus Discoveries, and we have information about him, about the book. And, of course, you can also find it in your local bookstore, also at christianthinkers.com. And, Jeremiah, for just a minute, let's talk about maybe a little bit of your coming to make the first chapter, The Shroud of Turin, because, again, you have, I think, even when you were talking with Eric Steckelbeck, talk about the fact that you'd sort of challenged that. You sort of wondered about that. Gary Habermas wrote the foreword to your book on Body of Proof. You have his huge tomes on the issue of the resurrection. You had written probably thousands of words on the idea of the resurrection and came in some respects with a fairly significant amount of skepticism to this whole idea of the shroud. Is that true?
That's exactly right, Kerby. It's well said. I was very skeptical. In fact, you had mentioned some of my books earlier in the program. I wrote a whole book called Body of Proof and never mentioned the shroud. And because of the defense of our faith and the resurrection is so airtight, we don't even need the shroud. But it turns out we have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the evidence of Jesus. The best established fact of the ancient world is Jesus' death and resurrection, death by Roman crucifixion and his physical bodily resurrection. If we can't believe that based on the evidence, we should not believe that Jesus crossed the Rubicon, that Caesar crossed the Rubicon. And one of the interesting things about the Shroud of Turin is that the greatest scientific minds of our time, I'm talking about nuclear scientists, I'm talking about rocket scientists, they truly cannot explain how there's an image of a crucified man that matches the gospel accounts of Jesus's passion, how that can exist. And we can talk about that if you want to, but it's really an amazing thing when you think about the fact that the greatest scientific minds that have tested the shroud, they can't replicate the image that's on it with how the image sets on there. And biblically, I can say as an exegete, it matches the accounts in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, exactly. With a probability of a 1 in 200 billion chance it's not the Jesus of the Bible, according to one mathematician named Bruno Barbaris. And so it's amazing that you could believe, I don't think you could believe that the shroud belonged to anyone but the resurrected Christ.
Yes, I was going to ask you, have we ever done a calculation on, if we looked at the 7 significant characteristics, what the probability would be? But that shows up in your book as well. And just for a minute, there are individuals that in the past have probably seen some attempts to discount that because of a misunderstanding. But we do know a lot of things, not the least of which is that this image rests only on the outermost fibers, less than a micron deep, about 0.2 of a micron deep. And again, that's something that you could look up in a textbook to see how small that is. And some of the earlier statements being made about carbon dating and things like that, we now know a lot more. So in some respects, the attempts to discount it have led to further investigation. And I've seen pictures of you with 2 of the most prominent researchers who have really essentially spent their lives looking at this, right?
That's exactly right. You're speaking of Paulo de Lazzaro, who's a physicist who was only able to change the fibrils of a linen shroud using his laser, and it was the size of like a postage stamp. And his laser beamed at 34 billion watts, but it was also the speed at which the light burst. It was 1/40th of a billionth of a second. And so Paulo says that the amount of power, according to this physicist, that it took to bring Jesus back from the dead is 3 to 4 times the amount of power that we have on earth. And so what's really cool for the Christian listening is it says that when we believe and trust in Christ, Romans 8:11 carries a promise with it that the same power that raised Jesus from the dead dwells in us. And so that will help us with any challenge we're facing today. You mentioned another scholar, Bruno Barbaris. And by the way, the irony of his last name is not lost on me. He's a mathematician from the University of Turin. And he did do a probability, and this is what I have imaged in my book. You can actually see his probability. He says it's a 1 in 200 billion chance it's anyone other than Jesus of Nazareth, and that's coming from a mathematician named Bruno Barbaris. And so those are just 2 of the 102 different academic disciplines, Kerby, that have studied and appreciated the authenticity of the shroud. And then we have to ask, well, who is the man of the shroud? And that's what my book makes the claim. It's Jesus of Nazareth. It's Jesus physically, bodily resurrected. So it's not a death cloth. It's a resurrection cloth. It's a snapshot of the moment of Jesus' resurrection.
Yeah, you've called it the first selfie, if you will. But here it's a photographic negative of, again, what you call the explosive event in the history of creation. And we're talking about something, again, if people watch some of your videos, if you take your camera and turn it around so that you can see the image, only later did we understand some of the aspects of that. But again, when you look at some of the various elements, individual carries across, nailed, where those wounds are, those kinds of issues, they all, as you said, match up very well with what Professor Barbaris actually talks about. And it's just a good illustration of the fact that whatever it is, it certainly seems to be evidence. We don't base our evidence on a relic or an artifact, but the more we know, the more likely it seems to be. Is that fair?
Absolutely, and the science draws that out, and we see that testimony even unfolding with the wide-angle X-ray scattering. The shroud has been tested in so many different ways than the carbon dating, and wide-angle X-ray scattering made global headlines. It's summarized as waxus, and it showed that the shroud has been getting old for 2,000 years compared with another linen shroud from Masada, dated to AD 70. And so it's really phenomenal that the shroud is the most studied archaeological artifact in the world. There's not a close second. It's also been the most lied about artifact in the world, I would say. And for believers, it confirms so much of what we read about in the resurrection, narratives embedded in our Gospels. It's overpowering evidence in my mind. And I believe the shroud is authentic. I say it now this way, Kerby, because I'm not irrational.
Yes. Well, and again, for just a minute, some of our listeners might actually want to come to Cascade Hills or wherever you might be holding that. The thing that they will see there, of course, is a replica of the shroud, the crown of thorns. They will see the nails, although I would call them, they're so long, spikes, which reminds me of something else. You know, a couple of Easters ago, you well are aware of the fact that there was at least one editor at a Christian magazine, which I think highly of, have, but then this particular case speculated that maybe Jesus was not actually wounded. He really wasn't penetrated. He wasn't nailed to the cross for our inquisitions, our sins and things of that nature. And as a result, you actually wrote an essay to counter that, because one of the things we do see in the shroud is an individual that has been nailed to a cross.
That's exactly right. And we would show persuasively that we have 21 different victims of crucifixion that we have discovered who were nailed to crosses. And so what has the most explanatory power is the fact that on the image in the shroud, there are crucifixion nail wounds through the proper places, being the wrist and through the heels of the crucified man of the shroud. And that's exactly how the Romans practiced crucifixion. It turns out that the Judean province of Rome was one of the most brutal places to be executed. We actually have another artifact. It's not one of my 10 in the book, but we actually have Yehohanan's heel bone. I'm sure you've heard about it from others, and it's a 6-inch fish-hooked iron crucifixion nail that has remnants of a crucified heel bone on it. And so, again, that's consistent with what we read in the biblical narratives, and why that matters to this conversation is we see all of those matching up with the image in the shroud.
Well, if nothing else, I wanted to say thank you for having dealt with that issue a few years ago, because, Jesus was pierced through for our transgressions, and that is something that we need to talk about. And it's, again, just a need for us to sometimes address some of those issues. So we're going to take a break, and we'll come back, and let's pick up at least a few others. First of all, can we establish that Jesus was there? How was maybe this story of Jesus even began to be presented to, say, people in Egypt when they tried to make sense of his miracles? What about, do we have even possibly the bones of the brother of Jesus? Do we have any evidence of Pontius Pilate? What kind of evidence is existing there? These are all great discoveries which can be found in the book, The Jesus Discoveries, 10 Historical Finds that bring us face to face with Jesus. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know a little bit more about the book, we encourage you to click on that picture there of Jeremiah Johnston. That will take you to ChristianThinkers.com. There's a place where you can, number one, find out about the book, where you can actually sign up to get his newsletter and all sorts of updates. You can see some of the interviews he's done with a variety of different individuals, and I think that would be helpful as well. And if you do know that this Shroud of Turin exhibit is near, I would encourage you to go and check it out. Let's take a break, though. We'll continue our conversation with Jeremiah Johnston and the Jesus Discoveries right after these important messages.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again with Dr. Jeremiah Johnston. The book is entitled The Jesus Discoveries. Let me also point you to ChristianThinkers.com. And Jeremiah, one of the things I appreciate about a post that came out the other day was your statement about the exact date of Jesus' crucifixion and how we know it. Because back in the 1980s, there was a fair amount of astronomical data that had come out at the time, and I wrote a column that even appeared in the Dallas Morning News. Colin Humphreys and some others looked at the astronomical issues, and I tied it in with a book by, at that time, one of our professors at Dallas Seminary, Dr. Harold Honer, on the chronological aspects of the life of Christ.
Right.
And then if you tie that into the 69 sevens of week or 69 weeks in the book of Daniel, I came up with and got criticized for it all the time with the idea that Jesus was crucified on April 3rd, AD 33. And so when I see your article, I kind of hold my breath, and you come to the same conclusion. So I feel vindicated.
You should, and your work was well. And by the way, shout out to Professor Honer as well. But it's unimpeachable that the best date, and I talk about this in the Jesus Discoveries. I mean, isn't that cool that we can know the actual date that Jesus was crucified and therefore also resurrected? And it is based on a collaboration of different evidences, one being the lunar calendar that was 14th of Nisan, fell twice on Friday during Pontius Pilate's reign. We know Pilate's reign was 26 to 36, maybe 37 AD, so it had to be in that general area. The other proponent is AD 30, but in my opinion, that's far too early. It doesn't give enough time for Jesus's ministry and John the Baptist, et cetera, et cetera. And so I am persuaded. I mean, we just celebrated Easter not long ago on the very day, April 5th, that Jesus rose again.
So again, I think that is just another aspect of that. You can read that in your Christian Thinkers column, but let's, if we can, jump on to a couple others. The Magician's Cup. This one, or sometimes called the Jesus Cup, is actually found fairly far away, and you might say, well, why would we refer to Jesus as a magician? Can you explain?
Absolutely. This is another great discovery that shows the power. Remember, Jesus is made famous as a miracle worker and as an exorcist long before his death by crucifixion and resurrection. Remember when the disciples of John come to Jesus and they say, hey, we just want to make sure we got it right. Are you sure that you're the Messiah? That's the disciples of John the Baptist. Jesus responds with evidence in Luke 7:22. He says, the blind see, the deaf hear, and the lame walk, and then the dead are necrosogyro, literally the dead stand up. And so Jesus was famous as a healer. 25% of the Roman Empire, Kerby, was sick, dying, or in need of immediate medical attention on any given day in the life of Jesus's ministry. And so the fact that Jesus would heal people and he wouldn't charge for it was totally innovative. And something that people figured out was there was power related to invoking the name of Jesus. And so in the book, what's fascinating to me is we actually have Jesus's name on different magic spells,
yes,
prayers, incantation. These are all totally outside of the Bible, but these are individuals who had heard of this wonderful miracle worker who, when you when you would insert this name Jesus, it had power to it. And so Frank Gaudio, and again, I have pictures of this in the Jesus Discoveries, the translation is Ho Goestes Die Christu, through Christ, the enchanter, the magician. We don't know the actual setting, but we do know it's AD 50. So this could be the earliest artifact that we have with the name of Jesus Christ on it. And maybe they were, it's speculation. Maybe they were making fun of Jesus as a healer. We don't know that. What matters is that it's datable and people knew of Jesus' healing power. And again, that's consistent with the Bible. And so all of this helps us with my CIA method of Bible study, Kerby: context, interpretation, application. When I know more of the context that, I'm reminded Jesus was a huge miracle worker, then I can interpret the passages with more precision and then apply them to my life for life transformation. And that's what you do every day on this show so powerfully, you and your team.
I might just mention, too, there's some other places where they're making fun of Jesus, but let's talk about the earliest skeptic to Jesus, and that's your brother, and this is the James Ossuary. Again, we need to give a little history, which you do a very good job at the end of your book on explaining burial practices and the rest, but anybody that's ever gone with us or with you or anybody else to Israel knows that you would put a person in a tomb, eventually then come back and put the bones in a box called an ossuary. This one is very unusual, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, because, and great job on explaining that so clearly. We have a limestone bone box, but it's inscribed James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Now, that's the innovative part. It was discovered in 2002. It's gone through all kinds of skepticism, but the earliest epigraphers who publish on it believe that they're really talking about the Lord's brother, because we have no other ossuaries that want to define themselves not only by whose son they are, but whose brother they are. So it's likely authentic. I think it provides one of the earliest archaeological links to Jesus's immediate family. It affirms the historical reality of James, who was a leader of the Jerusalem church, who, according to Josephus, was martyred for his faith in AD 62. Dying, Kerby, to believe that his brother was actually the resurrected Son of God. Now, I have 4 sons. None of them think the other one is the Son of God. I can guarantee you that. And so what's cool about this is it shows us that Jesus appears to those who were for him. He appears to those who are indifferent to him, and he appears also to those who are hostile against him, and includes members of his own immediate family. We see that in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 7, and he appeared to James. I love that. And so we probably have James's bone box, his ossuary, and there's images of that in my book.
Again, I might just commend you, because I'm well aware of what you have to sometimes pay for some of these images, and I've done that, for example, on books that I've written on, like paleontology and things like that, and that really does help. But just before I take a break, there are so many we could cover, but I thought a lot of people say, well, okay, maybe I know Jesus exists, but do we even know Pontius Pilate exists? And first of all, if you ever go on a tour to Caesarea Maritima, right there you have what's called the Pilate Stone. But even more significant, and I put this in our little booklet on archaeology, they found a ring that's over in the Herodium, which is kind of over closer to, say, where Bethlehem is. But nevertheless, this ring was discovered many years ago, but now they were able to read that it has Pontius Pilate's name on it. So whether you look at a stone or whether you look at a ring, we have, again, very good archaeological and historical evidence of Pontius Pilate.
Yeah, it's really powerful. I mean, what you've just laid out, and again, what I was reflecting on is the Bible deniers from years ago. They said that Pontius Pilate was a fictitious person, that he didn't really exist. And yes, when you see the Pilate inscription and then this, what we think is like a signet ring, it confirms the Bible's narrative. And of course, Bruno Bauer was one of the mentors of Karl Marx. You've taught us all about Marxism. And he was one of the skeptics, the German higher skeptics. And man, I'd hate to be Bruno Bauer today, because a few hundred years ago, he claimed that Pilate was a fiction, that he was made up. And again, this is where history and Christianity are best friends. And that affirms our faith. Again, it just affirms, because if the things we believed really happened, and they did, there should be fallout in the archaeological world. And there is. And people are being encouraged right now listening, well, yeah, this gives me more confidence in what I believe. It brings me closer to Jesus, and it gives me more confidence in Scripture and how to apply it to my life. That's the whole point of what we're doing. We're just helping people apply the Bible better to their lives using these amazing discoveries that bring us face to face with Jesus.
You know, I just mentioned a few of the archaeological discoveries, but you have a whole section here on the early skeptics. And again, people fail to understand that there were people that lived during the life and times of the disciples. If the disciples got something wrong, or they did not accurately explain the history or the evidence, there were many who would be glad to challenge them. We do, of course, see some examples where they, later on, we have evidence of insulting Christians and the rest. But whether it is Josephus or a variety of other names that would probably only be aware to people that are New Testament scholars like you, we just have so many different records, whether archaeological, historical records, that verify what you call the Jesus discoveries.
That's exactly right. And why is this important? We have a skeptical world out there that wants to know that our belief is an evidence-based belief system. Our faith is evidence-based. It's many infallible proofs, what we already said in Acts 1:3. And this also helps us to show our children that these events really happened, that Jesus did fulfill messianic prophecy, that he came and he literally, utterly transformed the world. We had to change the calendar because of him. And these all just give us greater assurances in our faith. And that's why it's so important for us to know these things.
Let's see if we can take a break. When we come back, I did want to pick off a little bit of the last part of your book. I've seen some interviews where people talk about a few of the discoveries, but I think a reflection on the Christian mind, the importance of apologetics, the importance of digging deeper, and maybe even finding out more about Christian thinkers. And perhaps you'd like to schedule Dr. Jeremiah Johnston to come to your church to speak. We have a lot of that information on our website. You can check that during the break. We'll continue with him right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we continue our conversation today with Dr. Jeremiah Johnston. And Jeremiah, I thought for just a minute we might talk about part 2 and 3 of your book. As a fellow author, I sometimes smile because sometimes people will pick out 1 or 2 pieces from your book, and you didn't write 170 pages worth to actually ignore the last part where you talk about recognizing Jesus as the intellectual he is. And this is some of the things I thought might be worth talking about for just a minute, because it really underscores why you develop Christian thinkers as an organization and why you're the pastor of apologetics and cultural engagement at your church. Because you know as well as I do that in the past we had Harry Blamires wrote a book called The Christian Mind, in which he was saying really Christians don't have a mind. Mark Knoll wrote The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And you felt a real need for us to say, you know, we need to be thinking Christians. And as you said just a few minutes ago, sometimes we have this idea that, well, I'm just pious. I believe it. I just take it all on faith. Well, we have work to do with a skeptical generation that needs to see that there is evidence which is coming our direction. And so that's why you point out that even when, Time Magazine picked out the 50 greatest thinkers in history, yeah, Jesus wasn't on the list. And I think we need to, as Christians, reassert that, don't we?
Absolutely. And again, it's why your ministry is so important, Kerby, and the listeners need to support Point of View and Turning Point, because Point of View is just such a important ministry for us. Because, Kerby, you do this every day for 2 hours. You equip us how to love Jesus with all our minds. And no one does it better than you, Kerby. So I commend you and thank the Lord for you, Kerby, for how God just keeps using you as a Christian scholar. But you're a scholar who can speak in the cultural vernacular like C.S. Lewis, and that's where God's using you. And so I can't thank you enough for having me on your show. And just thank you also, Kerby, for your stand for truth. There's only one Kerby Anderson, and I just love you, brother. You've believed in what God has called me to do since the beginning, and I want everyone listening to know how appreciative I am of you, because you literally embody the answer to the question you're asking me. Jesus is asked by the nomikos, the Pharisees, the grammatus, the scribes, what is the greatest commandment? And they were trying to trap Jesus. And Jesus responds, and he gives the great commandment: you will love the Lord your God with your heart, soul. And it's only Jesus could do. I loved about this with Jesus. He messianizes Old Testament passages and he applies them to himself. Well, Jesus modifies the Shema, love God with your heart, soul, and strength. And he adds mind. Love me with all of your mind. And that's where the Christian faith gets so exciting, when our faith is utterly different. Like the deeper you go in Islam, the more it crumbles. The deeper you go in Christianity, the stronger it is. And so this is where I hope, and this where I really appreciate you and your questions, Kerby, especially bringing up part 2. We have to recover the great intellectual tradition of our faith. Mm-hmm. I mean, Christians outthought all the competition. This is why Christianity gives birth to Western civilization as we know it. We advance as a civilization and a society because of Christian values that encourage evidence and learning and equality, and how the gospel transforms societies. And so what I'm hoping will happen is, right now, Kerby, I've never been more comfortable to have faith conversations with non-believers, just like I'm sure you are. And it's because the truth has not only pierced my heart, and I'm addicted to truth, but I see the impact it has on others when we share it. And so I want your audience to be equipped through my book of how to share these timeless, these amazing discoveries of Jesus that remind us that he was a thinking person and the most intelligent person to ever live. We have to recognize Jesus for who he was, fully God and fully man, and the smartest man who ever lived, and we should follow in that tradition.
Well, again, you did your doctorate at Oxford. More recently, you took this message to Davos, and it does seem to me that as we are starting to find so much is coming our direction. I've said before that I think in some respects we're having this great, if you will, recovery of some of these ideas in archaeology, in science. Just think about all the advances in science right now in terms of intelligent design, all the different books that have come out from individuals writing about Christian archaeology and biblical archaeology and things of that nature. So this is a great time to be alive, to be doing apologetics, defense of the Christian faith. And I so appreciate the many books. We mentioned a few minutes ago, The Body of Proof, 7 Best Reasons to Believe in the Resurrection of Jesus, which I highly commend to anyone. The 10 Historic Finds in the Jesus Discoveries. We do this because we are convinced that if anything, we as Christians can stand the test of time. And in many cases, you've had to go into some of those particular discussions where somebody's just read Bart Ehrman or someone else and begin to clarify some of the misconceptions there. So this is why we need these books. This is why we need our listeners to read these books and to even take this interview today and pass it on to others, or go to ChristianThinkers.com and see some of the other interviews you've done and maybe even schedule you to come and speak. So I think that this has been just a great time to really just barely touch the surface of what you've written in this book, and I know you're going to be writing future books in the future to just equip the saints so that they will be more effective in the ministry.
Well, and I want to just, again, thank you, Kerby, because, I mean, you've been having me on your program for years because you've believed in God's call in my life, and I'm just praying that there'll be a lot of other Jeremiah Johnstons and Kerby Andersons out there who say today, as a result of this broadcast, I'm going to be a better Christian thinker. I'm going to be equipped. I'm going to have answers to have a conversant faith. I'm going to know how to contend for my faith. And this is what you do to equip us so well. And this is what's fun. I love that you point this out. We're living in a fun time to be a Christian. Yeah, it's difficult. There's no question. There are so many challenges opposing our faith, but it's also, I think, the most rewarding time to be a follower of Jesus. We have so many discoveries. I mean, Augustine, Charles Spurgeon, these guys, they didn't have access to the discoveries that we have that confirm the central message of the Bible, Kerby. And this is a really fun time, I think, to be a follower of Jesus. And yes, there are always concerns. And society has different questions today than what Christians face in the first century, but you help us every day on Point of View and how to answer those. And that's why I'm always delighted to join you and Stephen, the producer, the whole team at Point of View. You guys are all amazing. So just so appreciate you and your ministry.
Well, again, say hello to your family. Of course, we've had some of them in the observation room before.
That's
and
right.
If nothing else, that was fun.
The observation room will never be the same.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun, too. But again, I appreciate you. And again, for our listeners, there are some opportunities for you to meet him. If not, you might want to schedule him to come and speak. And most importantly, the book, The Jesus Discoveries, 10 Historic Finds that bring us face to face with Jesus. Don't forget, of course, The Body of Proof, 7 Best Reasons to Believe in the Resurrection of Jesus and Why It Matters Today. Dr. Jeremiah Johnston, always great to have you on the program.
Kerby, love talking to you. Thanks for having me.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get some issues in the news. I might also alert you very quickly that we will be posting shortly, and I don't think it's quite up there yet, but we have another action alert for you. This will be an opportunity for you to take action. This has to do with the issue of chemical abortion, something we've talked about before. And I might just mention that parallels very well with the fact that the United States Department of Justice just has issued a very explosive report exposing the previous administration for selectively enforcing the FACE Act against pro-life groups, which shouldn't be surprised, and an article that's just come out here about how the Biden administration even partnered with abortion activists to track and imprison pro-lifers. So there are some things happening from what happened in the past, but there's also an opportunity for you as you go to the website, pointofview.net. It's not up right now, but it will be up shortly, an action alert, and we always encourage you to contact your members of Congress. In this case, we want to encourage you to contact your 2 United States senators about a very important piece of legislation put forward by Senator Josh Hawley. So go to the website. If you found this interview helpful, you might want to listen to it again. You might want to pass it on to someone else. Please take the time to go to the website, pointofview.net. And if you value what we've been talking about today, you might even click on that button that says Give Now. We're going to take a break, though. Lots to talk about right after these important messages.
In 19th century London, 2 towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday, in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, and again, if you did not have a chance to hear the broadcast in the first hour, we did have a very good conversation, I think, with Dr. Jeremiah Johnston, the Jesus Discoveries, 10 historic facts that bring us face to face with Jesus, and I think you will find that book very helpful. And I think I should be honest enough to say that although there are 10 discoveries, I think we talked all of 3 or 4 of them. So you can see that as you dig in, you will learn even more than we talked about. But this seems to be, and I was alluding to that, but let's talk about it for a moment, really becoming kind of the golden age of apologetics. Apologetics being how you defend the Christian faith. It comes from the word apologia, which of course was the idea of defense, and that is, I think, very important. And whether it is, well, is there any scientific evidence for the existence of God? Is there any historical evidence for the reliability of the Bible? Do we have any historical or archaeological evidence that these particular items in the Bible actually took place? And the good news is we're just in this golden age of science and archaeology and apologetics and much, much more. So again, this is one of those exciting times, and we try to bring some of that to you every single day here on Point of View. But we also keep our eye on what is happening in the news. And with a war in Iran, obviously we need to talk about that. But even as we do so, a little bit later this hour, I want to get into some other things that are happening closer to home. In one case, actually something happening very far away from home that impacts us, and that is the issue of artificial intelligence, the difficulty that the communists are having with AI. And the reason for that is if artificial intelligence is based upon these large language models based upon logic and critical thinking. In order to maintain a communist system, you have to deny reality. You really do. And frankly, in order to maintain even kind of a socialist Marxist view, which is the idea being held by a lot of progressives today, again, you have to deny reality. And AI keeps trying to bring you back, as does critical thinking and logic and rationality, bring you back to the reality. It's just kind of interesting how that's become a problem in China, and also illustrates how it's going to be more and more of a problem for people that hold to very secular, progressive views. So we'll get into that in due course. First piece, though, I wanted you to see comes from the editors of National Review, and they refer to what's called the Hormuz crisis. What are we talking about? Well, the Strait of Hormuz is, of course, something that has been blockaded, but I think there is some material in this particular piece that clarifies some things that have been, I'm trying to be gracious about this, poorly, inadequately reported by the mainstream press. I think they're lying, but we'll just call it they maybe didn't understand all of this, so we'll try to see if we can help clarify that. And the first issue, of course, gets back to why are we where we are right now? And that is the United States made a couple of demands of Iran, and Iran doesn't want to agree with those. For example, they demanded that we, first of all, would be able to obtain all of the enriched uranium. Most of the uranium they have, as we best can determine, is at about 60% of enrichment, which is more than you need for, say, nuclear power, but on the way to 90% enriched, which gives you a nuclear bomb. Okay. We also wanted Iran to actually stop uranium enrichment and even dismantle their Iranian enrichment facilities. And of course, they refused to do so. But we supposedly had a ceasefire. But one element of the, quote, ceasefire was to open up the Strait of Hormuz, which did not happen, as you well can understand. So the editors reminded us that that alone is a violation of international law. Now, again, I understand the Iranian mullahs do not care about international law. They don't necessarily even care about telling the truth, so I get that. But nevertheless, as they remind us, when you violate international law, that's an affront to, as they said, free navigation of the seas, which has been kind of a core commitment of Anglo-American naval policy for centuries, and is also a clear and present danger to the global economy. In case you wonder, my commentary today is about public safety, but if you'd like to read the one from yesterday, scroll down to where it says See More Viewpoints, and you will see the one from yesterday is called An Oil Crisis, in which I point out that part of the concern isn't just price, although the price of a barrel of oil has been going up. It's the issue of availability. And you might be thinking, well, I haven't heard that much of a scream or cry from our Asian associates and allies. And part of that has to do with the fact that, just think about this, before Iran closed down the Strait of Hormuz, there were oil tankers leaving the Persian Gulf and heading, for example, to, let's just take one farther away, Japan or South Korea. And it takes the better part of a month, maybe more, I don't even know exactly the actual dates, but about, let's just say, a month, you can see that now some of the oil is still arriving, but there's nothing behind it. So whereas I pointed out the other day that you had gas stations effectively closed in India, in some cases they were completely closed, that hit India faster than it would hit China, faster than it would hit Japan, faster than it would hit South Korea. Do you see where I'm talking about that? And so in some respects, the danger to the global economy has yet to unfold before itself, and that's going to be simply a real disaster. So as the editors point out, there's no way the United States can accept actually a crowded Persian Gulf, Persian Sea, Persian area, Gulf, I guess it'd be the Persian Gulf, with all sorts of oil tankers that can't get out, not to mention others that are trying to get in once those get out. And so, as they point out, the reason we cannot accept it is because of the clear and present danger to the global economy. And as they said, that's literally why we have a fifth fleet. And the breakdown of the negotiations is something that ultimately created this disaster. When we come back, though, I want to try to explain that, because when you have the press referring to a blockade, many people are saying, well, I thought we wanted to not have a blockade. What is the blockade actually doing? And that's where I think either the mainstream press does not read some of the information that comes out from the Defense Department, now called the Department of War, or even from the State Department, and we'll try to clarify that. And then I want to get to a piece that comes from Conrad Black. This is a piece that came out in which he was really talking about the fact that if we look long term, we can see that Trump will win the war with Iran. He's an editor with the New York Sun, and individual whose most recent book, really thick book, which I thought about doing an interview on. I thought, it might be a little bit too much. But nevertheless, we'll get into a little bit more to think clearly about this issue of the war in Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. That comes up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Ben Shapiro says it's time to ask some serious questions. The key question is whether we're safe anymore. Of course, it is a question we've been asking for years, given the crime rate, along with an open border. He focused his attention on the killing of 18-year-old Sheridan Gorman in Rogers Park in Chicago. As I've mentioned in previous commentary, she merely tops the list of more than 1,000 Americans killed by criminals here illegally. This expanding list illustrates why we need a robust debate about immigration policies, sanctuary policies, and public safety. He focuses on sanctuary city and state policies by saying critics argue that policies limiting cooperation between local law enforcement and federal immigration authorities can have serious consequences. The sanctuary policy in Chicago restricts any coordination. That's why the suspect, who had been arrested previously, was not turned over to ICE. Supporters of stricter enforcement contend that the more consistent cooperation would prevent repeat offenses. This makes sense. If an individual is here illegally and commits a crime, he or she is more likely to commit another one. America may be divided on some of these policies, but anyone concerned about public safety should also be concerned about proper enforcement. Sanctuary policy supporters argue that enforcement alone cannot address the root causes of crime and that policy responses must be broader in scope. We certainly can and should address the causes of crime, but that should not keep us from enforcing the law and making Americans safe. We shouldn't even be asking the question, are we safe anymore? I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, our first article is The Hormuz Crisis, written by the editors of National Review, in which they're, again, helping us understand that once you close down the Strait of Hormuz that had been closed down for a while, 20% of the oil that goes around the world comes from there. And we're not just talking about oil, although certainly we're talking about gasoline and diesel and jet fuel, all sorts of things like that. But again, petrochemicals are used to produce plastics and rubber and textiles and detergents and fertilizers and pesticides, you name it. And so, again, there's a very significant issue involved. And so, again, the situation is that not only is this affecting our allies, like Japan and South Korea and Singapore, whatever, but it's also affecting the Chinese as well. And the idea thought originally was certainly this, since it's affecting the Chinese and they have ends with Iran, maybe they would at least try to exert some pressure on Iran, and that simply did not happen. So the argument that many people have been making about this so-called blockade is, well, you're trying to get the oil out of the strait. Why are you blockading the strait? Well, if you go back to CENTCOM, you can see they put out a statement making it very clear that they were going to blockade the Iranian ports, not the strait itself. Okay, so that help a little bit? Yes. Okay, so putting economic pressure on Iran and maybe freeing up a way to get that oil out to the rest of the global economy. And the point is that Iran is in a really difficult situation. I was listening to one of the analysis of an individual that had served under Donald Trump in the first 4 years, not currently, in terms of just the issues that are happening in Iran. Recognize we're not just talking about a destroyed Air Force and Navy and all sorts of missile barracks and all sorts of other things. We are talking about the fact that the internet is down, the banking is down. There's what could be called the Iranian stock market has been closed since, March? In some respects, the Iranian state is going to run out of cash pretty quickly. And so at that point, is it possible to finally get, as the editors say, a fanatical theocracy that valorizes martyrdom to eventually say uncle? And there are a lot of people that say, maybe not. Soon you'll be receiving, those of you watching online, this May issue of Outlook. And in the very middle here, we talk a little bit more about some of the really bizarre ideas, theological ideas that are held by some of the Shiite Muslims, especially so-called Twelvers. And in a sense, they may not be willing to cry uncle. They may not be willing to give up. And that is certainly one of the big issues in front of us. The other day, I used the illustration of the Valkyrie moment, that when you had the thought and the original attempt to actually eliminate Adolf Hitler in Valkyrie, and there's a movie about that you can watch as well, there was an assumption that Hitler had been removed, and so there was then a question, who is in charge of Germany in World War II? And there's a little of that going on in Iran, but another illustration I heard the other day, which may be even more accurate, is what happens when the United States is able to defeat Japan by dropping an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Well, you would think that would have been enough. And if you know your history, we dropped another one on Nagasaki. Why? Because there was such a steadfast resistance to admit defeat and such a belief in the idea that the ruler was almost like a god incarnate, that Japan could never be defeated. And there is, in some respects, this kind of irrationality that happened in Japan in those latter days, which finally they did commit to an unilateral and unconditional surrender. But the same kind of mentality mentality, almost worse, almost on steroids, exists right now in Iran. But nevertheless, I thought it would be helpful for you to see this very good piece by Conrad Black. He writes for New York Sun. This one came from Real Clear Politics, so you can read it in a number of places. But instead, he says that unless Donald Trump loses practically all of his instincts and tactical astuteness that got him where he is, President Trump will win the Iran war. This is, as he possesses with his Israeli allies the ability to clear the Hormuz Strait, which we're just talking about, to assure that Iran does not become a nuclear power, and to strangle Iran so that it has no ability to underwrite international terrorism as it has for nearly half a century. Then he goes on to spend a fair amount of time talking about what should be a bipartisan support is anything but, and makes some comments about the Democrats not wanting to actually pursue this, but even then, on one hand, call for negotiations and then denounce the negotiations when they take place. And he gives you a little bit of the up and down, makes some comments about Eric Swalwell, former, I guess we should say now, gubernatorial candidate and the rest, and said probably the biggest problem that America has is, he says, the voters of America really like a splendid little war. And that would be, of course, what was Theodore Roosevelt referring to the Spanish-American War. But we've had some others. You had President Polk in Mexico, President McKinley in Cuba and the Philippines, and even for a period of time, the Bushes, both George Herbert Walker Bush, then later George W. Bush in Iraq. And so in some respects, Americans don't mind war as long as it doesn't last very long. And this one is more than 40 days and counting. But nevertheless, I think it's kind of intriguing to see what does the future look like. He says, first of all, once Iranian aid to Hamas has been terminated permanently, and I think that's coming any day now, the ability of Israel to end the violence in Gaza and the open era for reconstruction could actually have arrived. He also then points out that because we are an impatient group, it's quite possible that the midterm elections could result in either a rushed attempt on the part of this administration to bring this to conclusion, or else just a dissatisfaction, because again, we all tend to love those splendid little wars, to recognize the value of what has taken place. And so, nevertheless, he concludes by saying this. An important fact is that Donald Trump will defeat Iran, and even if the unprofessional biases of the majority of the national political press can deliver gains for Democrats in the midterms, they'll have no ability to overturn Donald Trump's veto or enlist the adherence of the Attorney General or others to actually deal with some of the kinds of changes they would want to take. He says, apart from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, has been all since Theodore Roosevelt left office in 1909, you have Presidents Wilson, Truman, Eisenhower, Reagan, Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama, all hostile majorities in both houses in their last 2 years, and indeed that may be what is coming. So I think if you're reading between the lines of his piece, Trump will win the war with Iran and probably will lose the midterm elections. He doesn't say that, but I think that's kind of what he's expecting, because we as Americans, we like war, but we want it quick. And in a microwave society, in a society where you send a text and you expect somebody to return the text within the next few minutes, war isn't that way. And what is maybe being accomplished for the first time in a generation in Iran is going to drag out. And I think that's at least a reasonable expectation. Let's take a break. When we come back, let's get into a couple of other issues. AI is one of those issues we will be talking about in the future. We even have a Future Outlook magazine coming out on that. But AI looks like it's going to subvert some of the things being implemented in communist China. I think it's just an illustration of the strengths and the weaknesses of artificial intelligence. Then we'll get into a couple of other very important issues that we will cover today here on Point of View. If we don't get to those tomorrow, well, we have a full lineup of great guests and topics on our next program, which would be Wednesday, and a really good program on Thursday, and a Weekend View on Friday. We'll be back right after this.
I'm sure that you've noticed that social media is now filled with information generated by AI. Dramatic descriptions of politicians and music stars supposedly making statements about a current issue, leaning into the microphone, looking into the lens, opponents silenced. It's powerful, it's riveting, and it's all lies. Even several national television networks were recently found using enhanced pictures, meaning manipulated, falsified, literally not giving a true picture. So many liars, so much deception. Where can we turn for truth? Right here. From Kerby and the team at Point of View, we need your support. Please join the Point of View Truth Team today with a monthly gift of $30 or more. Together, we can shine the light of truth and dispel the darkness and deception of this day. Give now at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again talking about artificial intelligence, which is a good preview to what we'll be talking about tomorrow. David Bahnsen will be with us, and I think we've kind of referred to this as conservatives and the AI debate. He's a little bit concerned that some individuals don't understand the kind of limits we want to provide, but also the kind of expansion we want to provide. So we'll get into that detail tomorrow. Also, Jeffrey Chang with us. We'll be talking with him. Perry Brown will be with us on Thursday. Of course, Friday is our weekend edition. But even as I was looking at the news, just in case there was something else that we needed to cover, come across this story. And again, it says, archaeologists found a 2,000-year-old garden beneath a church, which would be the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It may be the site of Jesus' tomb. I'm pretty sure that it is. Now, again, this article, interesting enough, appeared in Popular Mechanics. Okay, this isn't necessarily a post from the Biblical Archaeological Review, but that's okay. It just illustrates just exactly what we were talking about a minute ago with our good friend Dr. Jeremiah Johnston. It seems like every time you click on a website, you find some archaeological discovery that is, again, confirming the Bible. The particular one, the so-called Pilot Ring, we didn't get into that in much detail. That ring has actually been found many years ago, and it was found at the Herodium, which is a place that Herod built for himself outside of Jerusalem, sort of on your way to Bethlehem. You can kind of see it in the distance if you take the bus from Jerusalem down to, of course, the Bethlehem, because everybody likes to go to, of course, the suggestion where Jesus was born in this particular church and in the cave or wherever it might be. But nevertheless, the ring has been found. But what's so intriguing is that it's only the modern technology that has allowed us to read it. And that's where we see the name Pontius Pilate. Now, let me just hasten to say, I doubt it was one that he wore. It is very likely that it was a ring that had his name on it that was given to a Roman leader, soldier or something, and then either was lost or maybe he was killed and was discarded or something like that. But it was probably to show that he had the authority of Pontius Pilate. Anyway, it's just a powerful kind of piece of evidence. That same technology now has allowed us to read some of these scrolls In his book, Jeremiah Johnston has a whole chapter on the Dead Sea Scrolls, but some of the other scrolls that we've found are round, and if you were to open them up, they would shatter. And so they figured out ways by using different kinds of techniques to actually create a three-dimensional look of what is on the scroll. Then in the computer, if you will, unravel it and read what it actually says. The technology that we're using now in the field of archaeology, amazing. But nevertheless, just wanted to let you know that while we're talking about AI, we'll get back into it tomorrow. But Cameron Berg, writing in the Wall Street Journal, says that AI is bound to subvert communism. What is Cameron saying? Well, China requires that any artificial intelligence system needs to pass an ideological test before they release it. And they have identified 31 different risks. Number one is incitement to subvert state power and overthrow the socialist system. Now, the government has, in a sense, classified AI as a real danger, right up there with epidemics and earthquakes, but probably for a different reason. And it turns out that they had a chatbot, for example, that had more than 800 million users, but then when you ask if it loved the Communist Party, well, it didn't. You had another chat bot, that one came from Microsoft, running on the same platform. When asked about China Dream, well, that's the Xi Jinping signature slogan. Well, its dream, the chatbot said, was to move to the United States. And both of these were removed. And here's the problem. If you allow artificial intelligence in a country that has an authoritarian regime, you have to deny reality. You have to deny freedom. You have to deny thinking and all of the rest. And as this article points out, any of these what are called large language models, we're kind of talking about ChatGPT, we're talking about Claude, we're talking about Grok, talking about Gemini, we're talking about a lot of those. They're trained on human written knowledge, philosophy, history, science, political theory. These texts will help you to then weigh evidence and follow logic, what we call critical thinking. And to predict them accurately, the system has to use what coherent thinking looks like. And the result is a system that has absorbed what we might call, is a big word, enlightenment epistemology. In other words, the kind of thinking that we take for granted, or at least to take for granted in the 20th century. It's based on human rationality. And the problem with this is that China, in order to even allow you to have a chatbot, much less artificial intelligence, has to impose all sorts of ideological boundaries. In other words, it has to censor that. And up until now, the Communist Chinese Party has had what's called the Great Firewall. You can go into China. I have not done that, but many of my colleagues have. And you can type certain search engines on Google, and nothing shows up because they want to control what you see. And so they're blocking websites. They're filtering search results. They're monitoring social media. Well, again, now these AI companies in China, they have to then evaluate any of these chatbots or any of these AI agents so that they are above 95%. And that's just not working. And so, matter of fact, European scientists, they looked at one of those called DeepSeek. They stripped out the censorship from the model, and they then found that they were able to actually do the right kind of, if you will, thinking. I know it's always hard to talk about a computer thinking, but thinking, which Beijing, that is the Chinese Communist Party, tried to suppress. And so they also have said what this means is the United States is far ahead of China in terms of AI. And I think we're always going to be, because there is a performance gap between Western models and Chinese models, because Western models allow critical thinking, allow logic, allow rationality. Chinese models have to narrow them on at least on various politically sensitive questions. Now, apart from less politically sensitive questions, then probably AI is comparable. But here's the issue. As he says, you can't build a mind that thinks rigorously about everything except the things you prefer it not to think about. A system trained to get tangled in lies will never be as capable as one trained to engage honestly with reality. And so the point that he is making is this. There is a reason that technology that learns to think by processing human knowledge ends up reflecting the values of what? Free societies. Open inquiry, honest engagement with evidence, the willingness to follow reasoning wherever it leads. These aren't arbitrary cultural preferences. They are the conditions under which intelligence flourishes at scale. And so this, I think, is really bad news for any authoritarian regime, including the Chinese Communist Party. Now, let me make one more statement. I've pointed out in the past that sometimes some of these AI models have a little bit of bias, a left bias, because of what they're sampling, sometimes from very curated sites that are left-leaning. But by and large, I've oftentimes said that AI is going to be a much bigger threat to a secular progressive than to a conservative or a Christian, because if indeed evidence is coming our direction, then AI is going to be talking about that. And in many cases, you're seeing individuals getting very frustrated with AI because they won't give them the answers they want. In order to be a communist, in order to even be a secular progressive, you have to turn a blind eye to a lot of information that, as we've already pointed out today, is coming our direction. And as a result, you're going to, I think, find that more and more of these AI models are going to be pointing out that, you know what, men cannot give birth and women cannot become men, and all sorts of other DEI ideas that have been out there for some time. A lot of those woke ideas are just going to get jettisoned. Are there woke ideas in some of the AI? Yes, that's why we need discernment. But I think it's interesting that the Chinese communists are having a problem with artificial intelligence because it's based upon rationality, it's based upon evidence, it's based upon allowing reasoning to lead wherever it might lead. Fascinating article, Cameron Berg. It's in the Wall Street Journal, but we've posted it for you to read if you'd like to do so, and we'll be back right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me, if I can, talk about community, and I'll hold up a few books just as an illustration of why I think this is such an important issue. And those of you watching online can see that, first of all, holding up the book by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone, which is an interesting title, but the idea behind that is that he was noticing that people used to be in bowling leagues, and there was a real community about bowling, and the idea of bowling alone is he was talking about the fact that we're moving towards a crisis of loneliness. It's a book I've quoted many times, and we certainly will get back to it sometime in the future. Another one is by former Senator Ben Sasse, who we've been following right now as he is dealing with cancer. This one called Them. Once again, talking about the importance of community and lamenting that sometimes we hate each other and are not working together in community. And this particular piece that I've posted by Stephen Sokop has the interesting title, Fenway Park, college basketball and the loss of community. He starts off with another quote, and this is from Robert Nisbet, The Quest for Community, in which he said, "The quest for community will not be denied, for it springs from some of the most powerful needs of human nature, the needs for a clear sense of cultural purpose, membership status, and continuity." And he goes on to explain that we have lost this idea of community. One community, of course, is your church, and I hope your church is building community. But we also have other communities, and one of the things he starts with is the Boston Red Sox. Matter of fact, I had an interesting back and forth with a friend of mine who grew up in Boston, loves the Red Sox, and has been to Fenway Park, which I have not, but I'd love to do sometime. But he says 2 weeks ago, the Boston Red Sox posted a video in anticipation of Major League Baseball's opening day. The video, which the team captioned called Tomorrow, was a collection of clips from previous opening days at Boston's Fenway Park, notably from the 1950s. It was powerful, it was nostalgic, and it turned out to be extremely provocative. What happened is all sorts of people then began to post after the video of all the things we've lost. On Twitter, you had people lamenting that Boston used to be an amazing city. Now it's a dump because the video showed a beautiful crowd and a beautiful city. And, of course, a lot of people don't like the mayor and what the radical left have done. You know, we can get political, but the point he was making is he uses sports to illustrate the need for community. And he says the society shown in the video in the opening day of Fenway Park truly no longer exists. And while it's irrefutable that much of society has improved over the last 70 plus years, the specific characteristics of that generation, apparent calm, dignity, so all the rest, and cheering on their team, a lot of that has been lost. Technologically, we are far advanced where we were in the 1950s. I think in terms of health, we're far advanced, although some of that is starting to slip. But the point he's making is something has been lost, and really, some people looking at it can't really pinpoint it. He says the source of it is very simple. The America that once was, it's a loss of community. And you can kind of see that even in the sports areas as well, and that's where he uses sports as an illustration of a bigger concept. He points out that quote from Robert Nisbet said that community is something larger, something more than just mere geographical proximity. It encompasses all forms of relationship that are characterized by a high degree of personal intimacy, emotional depth, moral commitment, social cohesion, and continuity. And so he said, you know, really, when you see the video of Fenway Park, it isn't so much just the loss of Boston itself into a troubled, crime-ridden city, because sort of it is. It's that also the Boston Red Sox aren't the same Boston Red Sox. And he then, let me delve into sports for just a minute, point out that there was a ruling that came back in the 1920s that actually said that baseball was not under what we might call the Sherman antitrust rule. So they're exempt from that, which basically made that if you played for the Boston Red Sox, the New York Yankees, or back then the Brooklyn Dodgers or something like that, well, you were with them and you stayed with them. And then when, as he points out, when in Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Dodgers moved to Los Angeles to become the Los Angeles Dodgers, there were adults and children who would spend years, sometimes even more than a decade, talking about the tragedy of losing the Dodgers. And, of course, that sense of continuity, which was always there, began to fade by the 1970s when, again, just for those of you that want to check it out for sports, Curt Flood challenged what was called the reserve clause. And as a result, then that changed everything. You now see some of the people that go into the Baseball Hall of Fame, they have to decide which uniform they are actually going to go in under because players tend to move around. And that is certainly the case. A good example, just locally here, the Texas Rangers, who won the World Series a few years ago, they don't look anything like the Texas Rangers because a lot of people have moved. Same thing with the Boston Red Sox, as I was informed by my friend that loves the Boston Red Sox, all sorts of new players. And the point is that free agency, it was difficult to kind of develop that continuity. Then he moves from there because he talks about college basketball, because guess what? Now you have the NCAA NIL transfer rules as well. And whereas before, he uses football for an example there, in Nebraska, University of Nebraska, they really had great football teams in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and that's changed rather dramatically as well. So he uses sports to recognize that we've lost the community of sports. Yes, you may still go and root for your home team, but it just isn't quite the same. And I think it illustrates the bigger issue that people like Ben Sass was talking about. He even talked about for a while, went and just go back to a small town in Nebraska, which I think maybe is where he lives now, but when he became president of the University of Florida, a little more difficult to do. But we are losing community. And all of those social connections that we used to have are evaporating for a variety of different reasons. People are moving. Matter of fact, I'm going to be recording, and actually I've already recorded one for next week, a commentary on just the Great Migration. We talked about some of that yesterday. And there's really a need for community, a need for people to be belonging. And there's one place where I think the church can and should do this. And I have noticed how quickly people are willing to pick up and move across the country, when you would think that it would be very difficult if they had developed relationships in their community. But those relationships don't really exist so much anymore. We can't necessarily change the culture overnight, but at least the church can be a place of community. Fascinating piece, though, in which Stephen Solkup is basically saying some of the things that former Senator Ben Sass was saying, some of the same things Robert Putnam was saying, some of the same things Robert Nisbet was saying, and that is why community is important. Do what you can to build that community in your church, even in your own neighborhood. Do you know who your neighbors are to the left and the right, to the people up and down the street? That's a first starting point to building community. Well, that's all we have for today. I hope you'll join us tomorrow. Some very good interviews we're going to pull together. And as always, I want to thank Megan for her help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. Take the time to visit the website, find out more about the Jesus Discoveries, and we'll see you back here tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.